Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Jeremy Wattenbarger. Jeremy is an incident commander over at, where are you here? Sayer Technologies.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jeremy. Could you give our audience a little background on your career thus far?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been in the industry for about 25 years working technology-based roles, past 13 years doing cybersecurity and DFIR type roles. So been around for quite a while, seen a lot of different things, seen a lot of different changes, started in 1997. So that should give you a little bit of an idea of how long I've been in the industry.
Very cool. What have you been doing most recently? Has it been, I believe it's been DFIR primarily?
It's been primarily DFIR in the past, 12, 13 years. That's all I've been doing.
Gotcha. Well, we talk a lot about the talent gap on this show. Obviously, the core, I think, focus of the show has always been to kind of talk to hiring managers about their hiring challenges and figure out how we can solve some of the gap from the hiring perspective. But also wanted to get your perspective as somebody who's been a job seeker in recent times. I think you have some pretty interesting stories to tell. So I'd like to kind of inform our audience, a lot of which are hiring managers, what's going on out there. What are some of the best practices, worst practices when it comes to hiring, and what job seekers are actually seeing out there. So I guess I'll kind of start off by asking you, do you think the cybersecurity talent gap is a real thing? And if so, what does it look like in your mind?
Well, I mean, I've been in the industry, like I said, for quite a while. I don't really see it as we have a gap. We have more of a hiring issue is what we have, and a development and pipeline issue within the companies. You see that over and over repeatedly. Companies stating, hey, we don't have enough talent, we don't have enough people, and then now we've had a completely opposite turn this year where they started laying off, hundreds of thousands of employees across multiple companies. So no, I don't think there's really a talent gap out there. There's lots of talent sitting out there waiting to be hired, whether it's entry level or mid level, senior level. Doesn't really make a difference. There's plenty of it out there. It's does your company have the budget and the openings for them to be able to bring in the right talent?
Yeah, and the process too. What would you attribute some of the hiring challenges out there to? Like, what do you think are the primary causes of companies saying, "Hey, we can't find good people"?
Well, I think some of it is not understanding the actual role and what they're wanting to hire for. I talked to, I was laid off in March, and in talking to, I interviewed with probably last time I checked, like over 75 different companies. Wow. So, I mean, and, going through that process and talking to them, a lot of the companies, they'll give you a job description. The job description is very outdated, or the job description highlights a whole bunch of things that basically would be multiple positions within the company. They really don't have a specific role that they want the person to fill. And then that causes problems whenever you start going through the interview process, because you go through multiple interviews. People don't really understand what their role is. So you're interviewing with people all over the company in different areas and different positions and responsibilities. What ends up happening is at the end of the day, they come down to it and they go, well, we don't really know if we want to hire anyone or not. Maybe we can do this with somebody in-house. Or we can find somebody else to fill a portion of this, but maybe not all of this. And, there's all sorts of caveats within that also.
Yeah, and I've certainly been very vocal about getting your head straight as a hiring team before you go out to the market and you start wasting people's time, which is what happens if you have all these too many hands in the cookie jar, the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, having, like you said, multiple roles listed on the same job description. In my experience, that happens usually because either the company had 2 or 3 people leave, in some cases more, and they just cobbled together a job description from all their the people that left their job descriptions, and often that's done by HR, and they don't necessarily understand that person doesn't exist, or if they do, they're going to be 5 times the salary budgeted for that role. I'm always a big advocate of hiring managers that know the field well, that are in the discipline, to really stay very close to that process, understand what the recruiting team is doing, what methods they're using to identify good people, good candidates, what HR is doing in terms of coming to a what they believe is a reasonable salary range, and job description
Yeah.
and all that good stuff. Like I said at the beginning, I think you have some pretty good stories. So could you share for our audience a little bit of some of your experiences here recently on the job market?
Yeah, I mean, some of the experiences have been, very good. The current company I'm working for now, 2 30-minute interviews and an offer within a few
Uh,
days. That's a great way to do it. It's very streamlined. Awesome, great job on that. Um, Other companies, though, 3 4 5 months of interviews, and you're talking about multiple interviews within the company, 9 10 interviews sometimes, technical assessments on top of that. It's almost like the hiring manager isn't empowered to make a decision on what he wants and who he needs and things like that. So you run into those situations, and then you've got the other side of it too, where companies have even gotten to the point, and I'm not the only one that's heard this too, but I've had 2 job offers that were sent out and then turned around and rescinded for budgeting because companies didn't understand their budget before they started to do the hiring process. That's becoming more and more of a trend, more and more of a thing. I've talked to other recruiters and HR professionals too, and it's the same type of thing for them. It's a nightmare. They bring in a candidate goes through the process. They might spend 2 or 3 months going through the process. They get a job offer. They're about to start in a week or so. Then the job offer gets rescinded from them. That causes all sorts of other issues because it delays your hiring, number one, because you have to go back through the whole interview process, and usually that means you're going to be starting over and interviewing again for another 2 to 3 months. So it's not a good process to go through. It's probably not the best way to do things. And this is really the first time I've seen that in the industry where job offers are being rescinded. That's usually not a norm type thing. A little bit about me too. I also worked when I was in younger. I worked in career services when I was a dean and director of education. One of my roles was actually placing students in positions, and I never seen it. I mean, 6 years in doing that, I placed tons of students in jobs, and I never seen any type of issue where job offers were being rescinded. The hiring process also has seemed to been extended out quite a bit. Like I was saying, 2 to 3 months. Normally, the job hiring and stuff like that was maybe a month, maybe less than that. But this 2 to 3 months, it's really hurting people. It's really impactful. And then the other side of it too is that, like me, I've went through all that process and everything, and I've been laid off 2 times in 2 years. So you go through the whole entire process of getting hired. You get on, you work a year, then they lay you off, and then you have to go to the next job and go through the whole process to get that job, and then they lay you off after another year. It's just companies not really having a clear vision of what they want in terms of staffing and where they want to go in terms of budget and goals. So I think that needs to be cleaned up a lot in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, this economic downturn or whatever you want to call it right now is causing a lot of issues that we wouldn't have seen, say, a year ago, where one, there's a lot more people flooding the market, and I think sometimes that can explain the saturation of candidates can explain the fact that the interview processes are getting longer, that there are more rounds. I think there's often a problem of analysis paralysis where hiring managers, they see so many candidates and they're like, boy,
Yeah.
I really just want to make sure I'm hiring the best person. So I'm going to really hone in on interviewing these folks and grilling them. But usually that's
Yeah.
counterproductive in my experience. The most qualified people that have their stuff together, they're not going to necessarily wait around unless they absolutely have to, or jump through a bunch of hoops. Yeah, I've certainly heard of companies doing the questionnaires and the exercises and case studies and stuff like that. That can go either way. I think if it's short enough, and if you'd be willing to compensate people for their time, that might be a good practice. But if you're not paying people, it's a very extensive thing. It takes a lot of time, and it's actually solving a business problem in some cases, I've heard, for the company. Then that's obviously not ideal. Have you gone through something like that was pretty extensive?
Yeah, I mean, I went through quite a few of those. The technical assessments, the technical type interviews. The assessments are probably the worst part I've seen. well, they'll send you, it might take you a week or more to fill it out. It may not be actual case study or a case or anything like that for the company, but just going through that process it's too much to go through it, because you're on top of that, you've also got to be doing interviews, and you're interviewing with other companies and talking to other companies. I don't know what they're trying to gain by having you go through a fictional assessment where you can't even ask questions in most cases. It's a basic set of instructions, and the instructions are usually poorly worded. It's not like there is a person who has a background in curriculum or anything like that were writing it, that was writing out the assessment. So you get this assessment, it's very bland, it's very vanilla. You can't really ask any questions. And then you have to go through it and spend hours of trying to figure out what they're wanting. And then when you do ask a question, they're like, we can't tell you. So you run into those situations. Development careers are in the same type of thing, where they'll send them, a large piece of code or something, or a program to write or something like that. And they have to go through that or analyze a piece of code that might take them, several hours or days. And really it's tying up the candidate, and moving them forward in the process. At the end of the day, look at the person's resume, see if they've been doing it. If they've done it in the past, and they've been doing it in the past, and they've been doing it for a long time, or even for, just a short period of time. If they've been doing it, they've been doing it. They've obviously been doing it at some level. I think the other side of it is that, the technical assessments would probably be best suited if you were talking about a very entry level candidate coming right out of college or something along those lines. You start talking about mid level, senior level, director level type roles, and now you're giving them technical assessments. For what reason? They've been doing it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. It seems like it's kind of a waste of time for a lot of the candidates, and it's a waste of time for the hiring manager to even have to go through those assessments, read them, try to understand what was going on. Some are very subjective in terms of, look at this data and then, analyze it and tell us what you think.
Yeah,
there's no right or wrong.
Yeah, there's always room for interpretation in most cases, and I think it is important for people to be able to explain their reasoning and talk through that with, whomever is administering that test or that case study. But often that's not the case. There's a sense that there's only one right answer, and you have to find it without any guidance whatsoever, which in my experience, especially working with a lot of consulting firms, that's not really the case.
Yeah.
It's always a consultative thing when you're working through a problem with a client, and it's an ebb and flow, and you're asking for more information constantly and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm kind of the opinion that if you ask the right questions, if you spend a lot of time actually thinking about the right technical questions to ask in your interview, you shouldn't need to do the complicated technical tests, like you said, especially for that senior level. And the senior level folks like yourself are less willing to go through all of those hoops. You mentioned you had 75 interviews. I think that's a lot. Entry level candidates do not have those kind of options. But once you start getting into that senior level, people have more options, and generally the path of least resistance is the most attractive to people that have options. So to any hiring managers listening, extremely important to streamline your interview process. I think there's a balance between not doing enough due diligence and having the interview process go too long. You don't want to be on either extreme. So for me, always the sweet spot is like 2 to 3 rounds. Couple of video calls, 3 video calls, something like that, and you should be able to make a decision. And if not, then there's probably something else going on. Like I said, there's either too many hands in the cookie jar, or you're not asking detailed enough questions, or you're asking the wrong questions. There's just so many things that can go into it. And if anybody's curious and they've had a bunch of offers turned down, or they're not getting people through the process and want somebody to look at it, I'm happy to do so. We do, free advisory on that type of thing through my company. So it's important, I think, for hiring teams to have a little introspection and really understand what the candidate experience is like, because it can really damage your employer brand for the long term too. I would imagine you, Jeremy, would probably be reluctant to apply to some of these companies again after the experience that you had.
Yeah, I would be. I went, like I said, it was 75 different companies, and then multiple interviews with most of those companies. And then you run into the situation also where, and there's been a few companies that I've had this experience with, where the interview becomes almost hostile. when you're talking about the technical side interviews, they'll bring an engineer in or somebody like that, and they understand their environment. They've been in their environment for however long. They start grilling you on phishing email, or how do you run this or how do you run that, and then you answer the question with your knowledge and your background and what you've seen and what you've experienced. And then they're like, well, what if we take away this tool, and what if we take away this tool, and what if we do this, and what if we do this, and then it just becomes just a silly exercise at that point. How far are we gonna get it to where we're just all I can look at is a Windows log at some point, and even that, what happens if the logging isn't turned on? What happens if this? What happens if this? And it becomes an exercise in futility. And I even had a few of them in the technical interview get so frustrated they started raising their voice. They started getting upset because they weren't prepared for the interview. They got into the interview process, and it wasn't really well scripted. It wasn't written out. They didn't really have a clear objective in mind. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get you frustrated, but actually they're frustrating themselves in the end because they keep going through this process, which they don't even have written down in front of them, or a guideline or anything like that says, hey, this is how we're going to do this interview. So you have no idea. You walk into these types of technical interviews, and they start going through that stuff, and it's like, really, you're not really prepared for this interview. You didn't really think through the scenario.
What would you attribute that to? Like, why is this happening where the engineers doing the technical interviews just aren't prepared or seem to get confrontational? What would they have to gain by doing so? I'm just trying to figure out what the motivation might be.
Yeah, I think more than anything is it's when they're getting confrontational like that, or they're getting upset or stressed out, is because they're not prepared. That's not really their role. They're supposed to be working on the technical side of things. People skills may not be their thing, and that they've got thrown into a hiring process. They're not familiar with interviewing candidates. They don't have that experience in working with a candidate, or trying to understand that the candidate has never even seen their environment. That concept may be foreign to some people. I've ran into some interviews, and the guy even told me on the interview, this is my first time ever interviewing anybody. They're brand new at doing some of this. So they get thrown into the interview process. They don't really know what they're doing with it. And I think that goes down to the hiring manager sometimes, just doesn't have the time to go through the stuff, or maybe he's not technical enough to even do the interviews himself. So it gets thrown over to somebody who's really has no experience or background in it. You also open yourself up for, HR and other, legal and, type things whenever you start having people on interviews who have never interviewed, have never been trained to interview.
Yeah. And knowing which questions to avoid. Like, you can't really ask about people's personal life and stuff like that without stepping into a bunch of legal traps, which was something I learned early on as a recruiter. It was something we were taught as a part of our training. But yeah, if you've been an engineer your whole career, chances are you've never gone through that sort of training. So that brings up a good point for anybody on the hiring side. Even if you are a hiring manager that maybe doesn't have the time, I would say probably you should make the time to do the interviews, because ultimately, it's you're going to save more time on the back end by spending some time on the front end identifying the right people. But if for some reason you're not able to at least prep your engineers to help them understand the right questions to ask, maybe just have them write down a list of questions that they would normally ask, and then just critique that if you don't have the time to write it out yourself. That might be a best practice. Or have HR assemble a list of standard questions, and then you could throw in a few technical questions, and then have multiple people review it. I think generally having multiple sets of eyes is a good thing. You get different perspectives. Things that you might have missed would come up, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's great feedback. Any other things you could think of that you would tell a hiring manager based on your experiences? Like, here's how to do it right.
I mean, from what I've seen, and stuff like, what you're saying, 2 to 3 interviews, that should be about it. I mean, if you can't make a decision at that point, going forward, if I ever have to look for a job, hopefully I don't have to for a long time. But if you ever have to look for a job, I'm going to be looking, if a company's going to tell me it's 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds, I'm not even going to bother with it, because to be honest with you, by the time I go through all those interviews and everything like that, half the time people aren't even, I'll give you, for instance, I went through one company. I think I did 8 interviews all total. The final interview was with their founder, owner, whatever you want to call him. And he gets on the phone. He's on FaceTime walking down a street somewhere eating a sandwich. And I'm like, can we reschedule this? Can we do this at a different time? Is there some other better time? And he's like, no, we'll do it right now. So we went ahead and we did the interview, but I didn't get the job, and I went through all that process. And we see that a lot where you get all the way to the very end and they give you like a senior VP, or they give you the owner or the co-owner, whoever. And really you're at that point and you're like, well, I've been through all these interviews. And, but a lot of times when you get to that last person or whoever it is in the process, they're like, yeah, no, we don't want to hire anyone, or we don't have the budget, or, oh, we're going to make a decision in another couple months. I've got one right now that, had rescinded the job offer, then turned around and actually put me back in their internal hiring process, and then never communicated with me where I'm at in that process. And they still haven't hired for the position. So I had to tell them I need to withdraw from the process, because as far as I know, I was still in the process of being hired. Even though I'd been offered the job as a contractor, they flipped it around and said, well, we're not going to hire contractors because we don't have budgets. Instead, we're going to hire internal employees only. Then they put me through the internal process with no communication, none. Never heard from anyone in HR, never heard from the hiring manager, nobody. And last I heard, I was still in the process. So I had to tell them, look, I'm out of the process now. And that was like 4 months I've been through that process with them.
Wow. Yeah. Again, great feedback. There's a couple of threads to pull on there. One was your choice of wording that I found interesting. I went through the interview process. So if somebody is describing your interview process as having to go through it, that's probably not a good sign. So easy way to avoid that is just ask people going through the process, how has it been for you so far? You can have a recruiter or HR person do it, if not, the hiring team. That sort of feedback will help you refine your process moving forward. Getting back to people is super important. Actually providing some feedback. I know there's some legal implications of that, and you have to be kind of careful, but even just giving people feedback these days is a wow factor, and they're more likely to, apply to you in the future. I've also heard of some situations, like you mentioned, where one of the higher ups did the final interview and basically actively discouraged people from taking that job, which to me is mind-boggling. You have so many people internally going through that process and spending that time, and all of that time and effort invested just to have it all thrown away by the person at the end of the road. It seems very short-sighted. So I think it is important to realize who's interviewing people and what their mindset is towards hiring. If they're super stressed that day, they're going through a huge incident or something, maybe reschedule the interview. Don't give people a bad impression, because every little bad impression will just chip away at your reputation, if not destroy it completely. And it takes a long time to build a reputation and very little time to destroy it. So,
I think one other thing is that, and I've had this experience with quite a few companies, is especially with all the layoffs and everything, is that, you, like me, I was a candidate, I'm going all the way through to the very end in a lot of these interviews. And there was several of those where another company had laid off shortly, right before I was to that last interview. And what ended up happening was it ended up being a company that somebody in the internal hiring process knew somebody at that company who had been laid off. So instead of, finishing out the interview process with me or offering me a position, they even told me, they said, well, X company has laid off, and we know some people from over there, so we're going to hire from there instead. And I just went through like 2 months worth of interviews with these guys. And so that's a horrible experience to go through with. And I've had it happen like 3 or 4 different companies where, literally there was another company that laid off shortly, right before the final interviews. And they're like, oh yeah, we decided not to move forward. We're going to hire from another company that just some of these guys got laid off. We know them.
Yeah. And the shorter the process is, the less painful it is when you have to pivot like that, or when you want to pivot like that. You could make the argument that company didn't need to pivot and they just chose to. But the fact that they had already sunk in and you sunk in 2 months worth of your time as a sunk cost, and then at that point had to pivot, if they had, just done 2 weeks worth of interviews and got everything knocked out, they wouldn't even be in that position. Any advice for the hiring teams out there that do have a lengthy process and maybe they know that they need to decrease it or shorten the time that it takes to go through the process, but they're not sure how?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is it's driven by culture, and cultural change is very difficult. Some of it is a procedural type of change, but especially at the higher level roles, reducing that process, it's going to have to be an entire team effort within your hiring team, and everybody's going to have to buy into that process, being reduced in time. Um, when you've got 6, 7, whatever it is interviews, and you're doing like one week and then another 2 or 3 weeks, even just shortening down to one interview per week would be a tremendous help. And I've had that situation where you did one interview at the beginning of the month, you do a second interview at the end of the month, and then third and fourth interviews the next month, and it just keeps going like that. Just reducing that time in between interviews too would help. Trying to schedule, if you're going to do 5 or 6 interviews, try to schedule 2 or 3 in a week if you can. I think those are good strategies. You still do your process that you want to do, but you're reducing the amount of time. And I think if the position is truly something you need to fill and you want to fill it, making sure that people's calendars are available. I don't know how many times I was told, well, this person doesn't have any availability this week to talk to you. It'll have to be next week or the week after, or the week after that, or some whatever time. And me, I don't take it personal, but to some people that would seem like they're really not that interested in you, or they're not really interested in making that hire because they obviously are willing to delay it for several weeks or months just to go through the interview process, just not inconvenience someone with a 30-minute interview.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely, from a psychological standpoint, want to feel important, want to feel like they're a priority. And if you all but explicitly tell somebody you're not a priority, there's other things that the hiring manager views as is more pressing than your interview, then yeah, usually that's not a good look, especially if it happens multiple times and they have 3 or 4 rounds, and each one it takes 3 weeks to get scheduled, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and you bring up a good point about having buy-in from all different levels of the company. Trying to think, I had another point that I just lost it. It was something about. Well, now I'm thinking about it too much, and it's not going to come to me. But yeah, I think sometimes it can be challenging when you have a ton of people that are all looking to make a decision. And there's too many stakeholders basically in the interviewing process, and everybody needs to feel like they're going to put their stamp on that candidate. And I think there's a sense sometimes that we can't afford to make a bad hire. So we're going to put people through all these rounds because we really, really need to make sure that they're a fit. I think what ends up happening is actually the opposite. Instead of ensuring that you're getting the best fit, you're actually ensuring that you're getting potentially the worst fit, because the people that do make it all the way through the process are just the people that have the highest pain tolerance versus the people that are maybe the most qualified or the most culturally interested in your organization. It's really hard to stay interested in a company if you have to go through 6 rounds, despite how much you might have liked 1 or 2 people. More people that are involved, the greater the chances are that you're going to meet somebody that you're not a huge fan of. So if you can keep it to the people that are just most directly going to be working with this new hire every day, that's kind of a best practice, I would say.
Yeah, and I think when you're hiring candidates, you're hiring the candidate that's going to be the best fit for your company. You're trying to do that. The longer you extend out that process, and the longer that they have to go through that process and stuff, candidates are not interested in that. They want to feel like they're important to the company values them. If you're not valued during the interview process, are you going to be valued as an employee when you work for them? And that's the question you have to ask when you're going through a lot of that.
Yeah, a lot of hiring, I think, is looking for red flags, and that goes both ways. Hiring managers, often their red flags will be too many job hops, which in this environment, economically and with so many layoffs, I think it's pretty foolhardy to weed people out just based on what they see as job hops, because it seems to be more so the norm versus the exception these days. But then, candidates have their own red flags too. Long interview processes is one. Uninvested hiring managers is another. Even just one of those folks is enough to turn most people off. Even if they like three other people they talk to, if one person seemed like they didn't care, that'll really shoot you in the foot. That goes to hiring and recruiting teams too. We've worked with internal recruiters where we're supporting the company as an external recruiter. The internal recruiting team either didn't understand the specialty, or they just didn't have a good enough sense of what the hiring manager needed as maybe we did, because we know the right questions to ask and we're industry specialists. So sometimes you could have internal recruiters rejecting people that would normally be really good. And this can happen obviously with external recruiters too. I think primarily more so when they're not specialists and they haven't really gotten to know the hiring manager very well. So there's just such a value in free flow of information, sitting down everybody of the hiring team at the beginning of a search for somebody, making sure everybody's on the same page as far as salary, expectations, process, setting expectations super early in the process. I'm not sure how often you encountered that where a recruiter actually told you, here's how many interview rounds, here's how long it's going to take. Was that typical for you, or was that the exception?
Yeah, they would tell you how many rounds. How long it takes is another that's another question. And I had add a few extra rounds, because as we're going through that process, like, oh well, we would really like you to talk to this person, or we need to add this panel interview where I had a few of them, 5 or 6 of them, where it was like 4 or 5 people in the room, and it was like an hour and a half, 2 hours worth of questioning. That's painful. I'm sorry. There's not enough in the world to talk about for 2 hours with 4 or 5 people just hitting you with questions one right after the other. It felt more like an interrogation.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that feels like an inquisition or interrogation. And when people are intimidated, they don't usually want to come work for you. They feel like they're being grilled. It's not a back and forth. It's not a conversation. The best hiring managers I've talked to over the years, they have a very conversational interview style. It's, hey, what are you passionate about? Let's talk about that. Are you going to be able to do any of those things here? Is this even going to make sense for you? Let's figure out if there's a fit both ways. So there's a lot of intangibles, I think, that go into a good interview process and good hiring managers and stuff like that. Any other stories you could think of that come to mind?
Not right off the top of my head. I mean, there's a lot that's has transpired over this year, and stuff, and it's just it's keeping the process as simple as possible, keeping it as straightforward as possible, knowing who you want to hire, and then making sure you have the budgeting and understanding the requirements that you need for the position. Those are the key pieces of it. If you can keep it simple, you can find great talent. There's tons of it out there, tons of people looking right now. And they, we continue to saturate the market with, more and more people who went through certification training, and educational training and things like that have just came out that are trying to find positions and work. Nothing wrong with hiring some of those folks in a very simplified manner and putting them into a pipeline and developing your own talent in-house either.
Yeah, and that's something I've been very vocal about over the years, is developing junior talent and building that pipeline, like you said, so that we have more senior professionals, people that have the level of experience that you do in 15, 20 years. I don't think there's enough of a focus on that. You could make the argument that maybe AI will step up and fill in some of the gaps. I'm not 100% sold on that idea, at least as of now. Have you ever been in an organization where they did a really good job of building the next generation of security professionals?
No, I really haven't. A lot of the focus is that they have a senior level position that opens up or something like that, but they have nobody to fill it, so they fill it from the outside. When really, they should have been working with a junior level analyst or something like that over the 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it takes to develop them into that position. Have a complete plan in place for their talent. I've always been a very big advocate on anybody who's ever worked for me. I always have a succession plan of, hey, if I want to move you up, then who's going to move into your position and how are we going to move you there, and all that type of planning that goes on. I think it's lost on a lot of the directors and managers and whoever, that does those types of hiring decisions. But I think it's lost on them that they need to be developing their talent in house, and they need to develop that pipeline in house. And they see it's a cost, it's a cost, it's a cost. And I get it, it's a cost, but how much more is it going to cost you to have to try to bring someone in from the outside and hope that they're a good fit for your culture, when you have somebody who's been internal working for your company that is a good fit for your culture, and they are, they already know, the insides and outs of the business. They understand it. I don't know how many companies I worked for over my time and stuff, where, your average tenure is 3, 4, maybe 5 years. And then they're on their way out the door. You might find some people that have been there longer, but, there's not a lot of it, because the people that are there have not been developed. They've left them as juniors. They've never developed them and built them into that role, or they just won't hire a pipeline at all, or they see the pipeline as another method to cut cost and just lay off whoever they've been developing.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned 3, 4 years. That, I would say, that's almost the exception of the rule these days. That's a long amount of time for somebody to stick around in security. For experienced people, there's just so much opportunity out there. I think a lot of the pushback on hiring junior and entry level people is often, well, we're going to spend a ton of time and money developing these folks, and then they're just going to leave in 6 months or a year for more money, because once they've gotten that little bit of training and their foot in the door, their market value essentially shoots through the roof, which is, I think, a valid concern. And it certainly does happen. I think the statistics bear that out as well. Gen Z, in terms of job tenure, way, way lower than even us millennials or the older folks. So any thoughts on best practices to keep, especially the younger folks, but everybody sticking around and staying in an organization when it is so expensive to replace people, to offset, I guess, the investment of building people in-house?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of, it's not all salary, but they have the environment has to be where they don't want to leave. They like it there. It's comfortable there. They understand it there. I don't know how many companies I work with that, even just getting a week's vacation is a nightmare. You start doing that to junior level employees you're trying to develop and train, and you're constantly, making it difficult for them, and they don't really have any type of work-life balance. They're probably going to be looking somewhere else, because it's the same anywhere else. If your work-life balance sucks at that place, it's going to suck somewhere else. So you might as well just change. Where if they got a good balance and things like that, they're not overworked. We see that a lot in security departments where, they'll literally work the employees into the ground. If you've got that good balance and you're taking care of your employee feels valued, and they feel that they have some type of progression in their life. It's not just a dead end job that they're going to be stuck in. I've been in a few jobs where it literally was a dead end. There's no promotion, there's no succession plan for me to move forward, and there's no pay raises. You're in a dead end job. Where are you going to go at that point? So I think that you have to clearly lay those plans out. And anytime I've ever done succession planning with employees as I brought them in, for staffing and things like that, I always made it clear that, I don't want them to stay in that role. I want them to move up to the next level. And this is how we're going to do it, and create excitement about moving forward. So that way you're not staying in that one job and you feel like you're only in that one job. You feel like, you get that same type of motion where you're changing jobs, but you're changing jobs internally. If I've got an analyst who comes in and they're entry level and they say, hey, I want to, work in pen testing at some point. Great. How can we develop you into being a pen tester? What is the things that we need to do? And we need to sit down and come up with a plan and strategize over, and put it in writing. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to develop you. So many hours a week or so many days a week or whatever, we're going to have you shadow this person. So they feel like they're changing jobs, but they're not really changing jobs. They're still working for your company. They're just changing roles within your company.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. Not everybody necessarily wants to move up and go into management. I think a lot of people do because they see that as the only option to make more money or the only way to feel some sense of progression. But lateral progression makes a lot of sense for a lot of folks that have that thirst for knowledge and just want to learn different disciplines or get their hands on new tools. I think the best security professionals, I was just talking on LinkedIn about this yesterday, best security professionals have that constant passion for learning and always doing something new, variety, stuff like that. It's almost table stakes at this point. Like, you have to be keeping up on the latest threats and attack vectors and stuff like that. So it's not even a differentiator anymore. It's just kind of a must have. But for the people that are truly, driven and always want to be doing something new, just listening to people and understanding what they want to do, what they'd prefer to do. Like, you might not always be able to accommodate that, obviously, if you're a hiring manager. And at that point, it becomes more about, I think, managing expectations. Like, look, you're not quite ready for a pen tester role yet. Please understand, I want to help you get there. Let's lay out a specific roadmap on how you do that. And I think a lot of people struggle and they leave companies because nobody spent the time to actually lay that out for them. They've never put it in writing or formalized reviews where they talked about their skill development and stuff like that. So you can do that, I think, on both a formal basis, quarterly reviews, that type of thing. You could do, weekly sit downs with your employees and just to listen to people and see what's going on. And importantly, if they have any frustrations, I think a lot of people, instead of bringing up their frustrations to their boss because they're afraid of the backlash, they'll just leave.
Yep.
So have you ever been in an environment like that where it started to get kind of toxic and then people started to leave, but it was kind of a surprise to the higher ups?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that happen. I spent 6 years as a dean and a director of education, managing for-profit colleges, and I went into a lot of situations that weren't, necessarily ideal, because my job was to go in and revamp campuses, bring them back online, get them out of audit and compliance failure. And one common thread I heard in a lot of them was, "I'm really surprised everybody left." Well, I can tell you why they all left. I started looking at what had happened there at the campus or whatever, and not just students, but employees were leaving in droves, and people were shocked as to why they were doing it. Well, the work environment basically sucked. I mean, they were, they didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing. They didn't have any kind of clear guidance. There was no leadership. There was no vision. There was nothing. It was just, here, go do your job. Here's your classroom. Go do your job. Or, we're talking about cybersecurity. It's the same type of thing. I've seen it where a company will be like, well, I don't know why everybody's leaving. Everybody's quitting. Everybody's going to this other company that, does the same type of role or has the same type of, business. And they can't figure out why they're all jumping to the other company. Well, you talk to the other company is spending more time with their employees. They're talking to them. They have a better work-life balance. They have, they can actually take a vacation once in a while. They're not working them 24/7, things like that. But I think sometimes it's almost tone deaf. I mean, they hear it going on. They hear the muddling going on in the lower levels, and they don't listen to it. They ignore it. They think, they're just talking. They're not going to do anything. And then the next thing they know, they got 5 people walking out the door. Take it serious. I mean, listen to what's going on, and action on it. If your employees are saying, that, they're overworked, well, why do they feel that way? Is there something you can do better that would help them not feel that way, and still get the job done? Is your budget just way too short and you're not being realistic on budgeting and cost? And that happens a lot of times. It's real easy to sit up there at the top and look at the budget and go, yeah, we can cut 5 people. Well, really, you can't cut 5 people. You may be able to cut 2, but not 5. And that's one thing that people have to look at too, is that, there's other people on the other side of the cuts. And at the end of the day, when you start cutting people, and this happened at one company where I was laid off, they cut, a group of people. They cut 30 or 40 people, and then they turned around and they started losing people like crazy, because they said, well, we can just cut these people. There's no reason for them. We can save money. And then they saved their money, but then on the other end, they had to go rehire a whole bunch of people because a bunch of people walked out the door at the end too.
Those people that they laid off could have been the glue holding the team culture together. I've been on the other side of that as an external recruiter, and I've worked with so many consulting firms that only want to hire from other consulting firms. And I'll talk to one person at a consulting firm that's unhappy, and I'll reveal their pain points. They'll tell me, what's wrong about working there. I'm like, well, hey, I got this other company that'll solve that pain point for you. Let's get you over there. They end up getting hired. And then once that first person leaves, everybody there sees that, hey, there's another opportunity out there that's going to solve our problems, and they start talking. And I've been able to pull whole teams of people from one company and move them to another because they all had the same pain point. So if you have one person leave, it's super important to figure out why did that person leave, and try and, I would say you could argue that, if they've left, if one person has left already, it might be too late. But you have to at least try to stop the bleeding if you're trying to retain people and figure out why that happened before everybody else leaves. When I worked at a huge corporate staffing firm, I was one of the employees that left after a big wave of people left. Once the floodgates open, it seems like it just continues. And I've seen whole companies get basically sunk in the DFIR world because few key players left. Everybody saw the culture collapse, brought new executives in, and then everything just turned on its head. So all these things I think are avoidable, if you just listen to people, which is really the main thing. Well, we're coming up on time here, Jeremy. So just one last question for you. Is there anything that we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
No, I think we pretty much discussed, everything that, is kind of what is going on, and, some of the directions that companies should go, in terms of just making sure that process is simple as possible. You're getting the most quick and efficient process, and doing it in a way that the people feel valued when they're going through that process. It's important. And I think that, if we start looking at it, from the perspective, when I first came into the industry, in '97, Rockwell showed up to our college to hire us. We felt very valued. The hiring manager showed up, and this is old school 1990 stuff, but he shows up, he comes from the airport in a private jet, shows up in a limo and in a 3-piece suit to interview us, and then takes us all out to dinner and sits and talks with us. And then we're all offered jobs before we even graduate. That's that's an example of, a company really wanted the talent, and they were willing to go out of their way to impress the talent, to make sure that the talent was there. I think that's lost now in the industry a lot. They feel like the talent has to impress them, but they really should be impressing the talent, because your best talent don't always get it when you don't impress them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's so many things you can do to wow people in your interview process. A lot of the stuff we just talked about, it's really not rocket science. It's very simple stuff. Just care about your process. Ask a good recruiter, ask a good hiring manager, listen to this podcast. So yeah, that's a great point, Jeremy. We'll appreciate your time. People want to reach out to you online. What's the best way to do so?
Just hit me up on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Jeremy, and thanks everybody else.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.